I think we're going to get started. Before today's seminar, I just wanted to point out that tomorrow we have another seminar. The URISE program is sponsoring Dr. Cornelius Tabazuing, coming from UPenn, and he's going to talk to us about his research in the biochemistry of periodic cell death. So for any of those that are interested in how cells die and one specific mechanism of how that occurs or may occur, please join us. It is not here in Science Hall. It will be in the Student Center in room 129. Yes, I remember correctly, 129. So please do join us. And let me remove that. For today, thank you very much for joining us. You and I are more than just the cells that make us up. We are not just bags of meat. We are not just cells and extracellular matrix and other things. We are not just the anatomy, the physiology, the pathology that we've been studying. We are a lot more than that. Even those of us in the neuroscience program, our mind is more than just the biochemistry of neurons and synapses and other things taking place in our brain. We are whole humans. All of us, each of us is a whole human. And while biochemistry and our science can describe what our emotions and what our conscience is, it may not encompass everything. So for today, I'm excited, and I hope you guys are excited to join me in welcoming Dr. Wynn Morrison. Wynn Morrison is MD and MBE, and that is Master
Bioethics, physician in bioethics.
Awesome. And she's practicing pediatric care at CHOP and palliative and hospice care at CHOP, where she directs the pediatric advanced care team and is director of the Justin Michael Ingerman Center for Palliative Care. She's also a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care in the Perelman School of Medicine at UPenn, where she teaches in the medical school both professionalism and ethics in each of those curricula. Her scholarly work is in the areas of pediatric ethics, of end-of-life care, and the medical humanities and patient-family physician communication. Finally, as we'll be seeing today, Dr. Morrison writes and recites poetry. And her poetry has appeared in multiple medical and literary journals, including JAMA and the Canadian Medical Association Journal, the Cortland Review, and Tar River Poetry. And as she mentioned to me earlier, she's hoping to publish a book of poetry in the near future. I'm trying to get her to do it in the near future as time allows. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Morrison.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here today. And I understand many of you are science majors or science interested, and that a seminar having to do with poetry may not be your usual. But one thing I'm hoping to show is that poetry can relate very much to the sciences, and especially for me as a physician, can relate very much to medicine. And then in addition to being a physician, I'm also work in bioethics. So I think it can also relate very much to philosophy. So as we go through these things, I thought it might be a little useful to hear some of how I got to this place. And I think at the end, we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers. So if people want to hear more about sort of how my career grew and changed over the years, I'm happy to talk more about that. But when I was in your shoes, I had, finished high school, always been kind of a math and science person, but also, had many other interests as well. Went to college thinking I might be a math or physics major, interested in medicine, but not sure where I was headed. And then my freshman year, I absolutely loved a freshman Shakespeare seminar I was assigned to do, and wasn't quite so thrilled with my math class. And I'm sure your math classes are amazing, but mine was not. And I ended up being an English literature major. At the same time, I did all the pre-med classes, all the science, required for that, and ended up going to medical school. Thought I would be behind everybody else in struggling because I had not been the science major, but found that having studied some of literature and humanities was actually probably as helpful in the patient, family, and even coworker interactions as maybe studying, the sciences would have been. So that's a little of my background. And then I tried to keep both interests alive over the years, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. So that's where I'm starting. I wanted to talk a little bit, let's see, make sure my clicker works. I'm going to project the poems that I read. And most poetry readings, you just hear them, but I think it sometimes helps people follow along to see them as well. Some of them will be small enough in print, you may not be able to see all that well, and that's okay. It will still give you an idea of kind of the shape of the poem, which is a part of the poem, is how it appears on the page. And so don't worry about it if you can't see it. There's no need to look at the PowerPoint. You can just listen, is fine too. And I'm going to start with a poem by someone else. We'll do some reading, we'll do some Q&A, and we'll do some talk about musings on the ethics and humanities. The other person whose poem I'm going to read first, her name is Jane Hirschfield, and she has a quote that I loved that said, "Poems exist to answer questions that cannot otherwise be answered. These great, deep questions of how to navigate the human life that are not susceptible to medicine or engineering or any of the other technologies of the practical world. Poems augment." And I would add one thing to that poems actually don't always answer questions. They almost as often ask questions and raise questions and make you think. So we perhaps shouldn't look to them to answer questions, but maybe to broaden our perspective. So this is Jane Hirschfield's poem that I wanted to read because it does relate to science and it kind of takes the science and applies to life. My proteins. They have discovered, they say, the protein of itch, natriuretic polypeptide B, and that it travels its own distinct pathway inside my spine, as do pain, pleasure, and heat. A body, it seems, is a highway, a cloverleaf crossing well-built, well-traversed, some of me going north, some going south. 90% of my cells, they have discovered, are not my own person. They are other beings inside me. It's 96% of my life. It's not my life. Yet I, they say, am they. My bacteria and yeast, my father and mother, grandparents, lovers, my drivers talking on cell phones, my subways and bridges, my thieves, my police who chase myself night and day. My proteins apparently also me fold the shirts. I find in this crowded metropolis a quiet corner where I build of not me Lego blocks a bench, pigeons, a sandwich of rye bread, mustard, and cheese. It is me and is not the hunger that makes the sandwich good. It is not me, then is the sandwich, a mystery neither of us can fold, unfold, or consume. So I love this poem because it touches on the fascination of science within the body, but then ties it to the mysteries of everyday existence. And it also makes you look at things anew, fresh, like maybe the sandwich. and think about how this sandwich is now becoming a part of me, maybe in a way that you did not before. So that, I think, is one of the great functions of poetry. From here on out, and maybe I probably made a mistake by reading an absolutely amazing poem by someone else before I then move on to reading some of my own, but the rest of them are ones that are mine, that I'm happy to hear questions about, or even if it's questions about like technique, why'd you say that way? And maybe I don't have a very good reason, but it is a lot of them grow out of medical experience and a lot out of family experiences, and some about just a fascination with science and the history of science. So let's see. Oh, there, did it go? It went on this.
Seems like.
Or maybe it did backwards. Am I pressing this one or that one or both?
Try that. Try that.
Just use this.
No, try one.
Okay.
It is moving.
All right, we got it. Let me just double check. Okay. So this one is written about a very common experience in the healthcare setting, what we call the family meeting, where you have to sit with the patient or the patient's family or both and talk through what's going on medically and kind of discuss next steps and maybe make some decisions together. But it doesn't, just get at that. Holiday concert. The doors open, we pause again. Voices singing in the lobby drown out the parents and the specialist alike. I think they added bells this year. The carols carefully chosen celebrate the season, not a faith. A guitar picks up a riff, the same one my daughter played so long ago in her one embarrassed solo on the school stage. Everyone singing about keeping up the fight. Down the hall, their daughter listens to the voices rise and fall. The doors open and the doors close. One thing I like about this is that for me, the doors opening and the doors closing kind of speak to the openness I see in poetry to interpretation, that I may not read the same thing in a poem that you do. And so the reader is bringing themselves to the poem as well. And it's not a set and fixed thing upon the page that can only be interpreted in one way. And I think we think of science as being all about facts and not about interpretation and all very solid and settled. But if we really look at it, it too is not always solid and settled. We are building, we are interpreting, we are interjecting ourselves. And I think it's actually something that humanities and sciences have in common. So as we look at some of these poems, I think, think about, how are you closing the circle yourself? How are you completing that with what you think about things? The next one, yes. The next one I'm going to read is another one about decision-making. This time it's about decision-making with a family member. And as Dr. Eden said, I work in ethics, and that means that it's a study of morality as applied to medicine. So how do we try to make the right decisions? And then how do we try to make them together and communicate well with patients and families to decide what is acceptable, what is right for that patient, and maybe what is not acceptable. Both guiding and collaborating with patients and families to do that. So a poem that just sits there and talks about ethics is made up of autonomy and, justice, and you have to balance that with beneficence. That would not be all that interesting. So this one is rather, it's a meditation that grew out for me of discussions with a family member during the pandemic, and tries to make it personal. And I don't know, remembering back to the start of the pandemic, which is actually hard to kind of remember, back when we didn't have enough masks and you couldn't find them, and we were having, I don't know if you were, but I was sewing masks at home, made me start thinking about many of these questions. Sewing a mask. The first effort is lopsided. Dark thread on light fabric shows every knotted stitch and wandering line. Thread bunches up at corners on the underside. The bobbin was pulled too tight. The setting's wrong. Failure is a teacher, so the second one improves. Don't start too close to the end. Manage the pleats by hand. Leave more room for the pins. Soon, I can keep the machine humming for 10 minutes without stopping to troubleshoot. It's a relief. My aging eyes are barely good enough to thread the needle anymore. I remember so many years ago, I would sit by your side while you showed me how to knot the threads in, to lower the presser foot, to go a little backwards at the start to seal the thread in tight. I was young enough to need my mother for everything. You are all knowing, all powerful, all loving, but not even God can be all three. I've grown older now than you were then. When I call, you ask me to wait while you grab your list of questions you wrote down. After we talk, I stare at my name on the form that says I will speak for you. Could I do it? You say you would want me to save the ventilator for someone younger, with others who depend on him. So I keep sewing this mask, hoping you will guide my hand past the needle and protect me from having to choose. So again, bringing the big ethical questions and making them personal. The next one, I'm also, as I mentioned earlier, often very interested in the history of science because I think that it helps us understand where we've come from, where we're going, where our gaps might be, and identify those a little bit better. And this next one, it started with looking at a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, and I think the drawing is going to show up. And so you may have seen a photo of this drawing in the past. It's a drawing of a fetus inside the womb. And the first time I saw this drawing, at first I was just fascinated by the technique of how it was drawn. But then I suddenly realized in thinking about it that all of Leonardo's anatomical sketches were mostly drawn from cadavers. And so in this case, the fact that he was drawing it probably meant that the baby here is what's called breech, where it's feet first, awaiting being born rather than head first. Normally head first is how babies are born and easier to be born that way. So in his day, if there was a breech position of even an about to be born child, it may have been impossible to deliver the baby. And in those days, that would have meant that probably both baby and mother died. So realizing it, looking at this drawing is what led to the poem. The poem also has, I should explain to you, it's another reference to ethics in the history of science. It is talking about the forceps and the inventor of the obstetrical forceps. Forceps are these hooks that can pull a baby out when being born. And can also turn a baby when they're not in the right direction, and is one tool other than a C-section that can help with deliveries these days. And they were originally invented by two brothers in England who were known as male midwives because at that time, midwifery was entirely a female business, and they were surprised that there were men that were getting involved in this. But they had invented the forceps, and the forceps were able to save the lives of babies that were stuck in unusual positions and the mothers. However, the brothers decided that they wanted to keep this secret for themselves because most of their clients were the royalty, and they wanted to be able to be the ones that would be called for any need for help so that they could protect their own incomes and did not share their invention. And so in the history of science and ethics, it raises many questions that are relevant to some things today of, Where is equity? What's required to be shared? What is not that could be a life-saving tool? So this poem is my reflection on all of this. Leonardo's sketch. See how the master's lines define each curve. The thick wall of a uterus lies open, and a fetus fully formed is drawn inside. He holds his knees in tight against his chest, sitting on his only exit to the living world. Fully rendered, nearly but never born. Breach presentation, failure to progress, mother and baby dead for most of history. When you were born, I pushed uselessly for hours. A quarter turned stubbornly in the wrong direction, head twisted just enough to keep you trapped inside. In the fourth hour of the night, you were pulled free by Chamberlain's secret tool, once used only for the offspring of the king. A blindfolded queen, twin metal hooks, quickly hidden after they are used. In my time, there was the glare of OR lights, surgical mask, blue drapes that blocked my sight. All in the room still held their breath while waiting for that cry. And now you run into my room, unaware there's any miracle in living, showing me the drawings you have made. I think I hit the wrong button by accident once, which is. I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, thank you. The next one also connects my own family and my family life to my work. It is, and I often write about both, kind of what is most central to me, where I spend all my time with my family and with my patients, and where is that overlap. This one starts while on a walk with my daughter, and a conversation we had where she actually raised a very interesting philosophical question. And then it transitions to a reminder of, a patient and family I cared for and what it made me think about that. And I probably shouldn't tell you so much, maybe, but it gives you a little bit of context. I should let the poems speak for themselves, but you can interpret however you wish. You don't have to go with anything that I tell you as being relevant. Letting go. My knee hurts as we walk, but it's so nice to be outdoors. You've grown. For the rest of our lives, you'll be taller than me. Every life's like composing a song. Even if the melody's familiar, it's never just the same. Each refrain with its own mistakes or mistimed notes. Then you say, so casually, that you felt you had to let go of wanting to be perfect in order to start making friends. Those flaws that let us be human. I met two parents in emergency, their daughter so close to your age. She had never learned to eat or talk or walk, all the taken for granted things. And what did they keep saying? How her whole life, all she had ever done was teach them what it means to love. People often ask me whether creative writing helps me be a better doctor. And, in thinking about that, I don't think I actually write for my patients or their families very often. In fact, I sometimes am even a little worried they might discover some of the things I've written because I write, my fields are critical care and palliative care so caring for seriously ill or injured children with maybe life-threatening illnesses as well. And, they're heavy topics. So what writing does for me is it helps me reflect and slow down and maybe keep doing my work. I think often connects with other healthcare providers, which if I have to imagine an audience I have, that's most often whom I'm imagining. But also with regard to my patients and the families, what it helps me do is pay attention to their stories and who they are. And so I think that there's just so much of a back and forth for me that being a physician helps me be a better writer. Being a writer helps me be a better physician. I once had a student interviewer ask me, if you had to give up one, which would you give up? And I looked at him like it was the craziest question I'd ever heard of, because I couldn't imagine, stopping one. They're so integrated for me. The next one I want to read is another one that relates to my family and my work in a way, and this is a little bit more about kind of the balance between the two and how do you manage all of these things. And it's also about how caring for patients and families in such difficult situations makes me reflect on what I'm grateful for, and never losing sight of them. Flip my page. It starts with a quote. When one of them breaks, we would give anything for what we have. Tony Hillman. The house is dark when I open the door, so you and the kids must be in your beds. When I peek in their room, they don't budge. My head against their wall, I study their sleeping faces. Children tucked under their own comforters, so different than the children back at work. Late days usually mean there's a family in distress, parents who haven't made it home, just a hospital bed and a cot, every one of them having a worse day than me. Through my own girl's window, the street light shines. We haven't managed to put up the curtains. The house of two doctors, lived in but ignored. Thank God they're good sleepers. I crawl into our bed, relieved when you edge closer. I hold you, tight enough, but not so hard that I'll disturb you. I feel the guilt of gratitude for all that we have. Each day, a reminder of all we could suffer. We see so many who do. Yesterday, I watched how every tree swayed in the wind, no matter how tall or how solid. Some days bring such strong winds. Do all the trees feel it when one of them bends and breaks? Like the day my daughter saw me on the phone on the sidelines of her soccer game. She couldn't hear the conversation. An update on a patient death. Not unexpected. One drop in an ocean, only one. Why did Anna stop to give me a hug? A shadow crossing my face, a bridge to the world. When he asked me to give this talk, I told Dr. Eaton that my husband once said I need to be careful not to make sure every poem I read somewhere is grim. And I'm aware that these are difficult topics I deal with, which I hope you're okay with me talking about in this life. But I decided I had to put some more lighthearted ones into. And I also once had my boss told me that I needed to not smile after every poem that I read, because some of them were really actually very hard. But I'm also, a super positive, optimistic person, despite the things that I do. So I do smile a lot. And this one, next one I'm bringing, it's not necessarily, doesn't reflect on science in some of the ways the other ones I brought, but it still has a little bit about observing and noticing details in life. And I think that very much relates to both writing and science. Patient belongings. A man a few feet ahead of me is pulling a rolling carry-on, a clear plastic belongings bag tied to the top by a white drawstring. I can't resist a glance in the bag, like a stranger who wonders about lives, the elevator or grocery line. It holds some clothes, playing cards, the ordinary things. And lying on its side is a small helicopter. Its unpainted wooden slats as thin as split popsicle sticks, a broken rotor bent awkwardly into a corner of the bag. Whether snapped in the crush of packing or during the boredom of hospital days, someone has decided it is worth bringing home. One more thing that needs to be mended, this reminder of taking flight. Days they might wish could be forgotten, may one day be turned into a game. And this patient, I hope, had a good outcome. And one more that's a little more lighthearted, also on the history of science. This one goes back to Charles Darwin. And, Charles Darwin, the naturalist, was infinitely curious about everything. And I read about one thing that he did where he had a bunch of earthworms and played music to the earthworms to see how they would respond to music. And this was fascinating to me, especially when I read that he had his son sometimes playing the music to the earthworms. So this one is about Darwin. Darwin's bassoon. Francis is shorter than the instrument he awkwardly hauls into his father's den. Silver trays are lined with specimens, seeds, feathered skins, half-written manuscripts. One tray holds his audience, a dozen squirming earthworms, pink and mute, half covered in black dirt. The boy would rather be in his galoshes, digging worms up from the earth by hand. An odd concert starts. The vibrations of the woodwind fill the room. Charles peers close. How do they move? He makes a note. What can they hear? Try this again. Now the whole scale. Again, again. Francis thinks this earthworm dance could be improved by the arrival of some birds. And it's, of course, a somewhat imagined scene, but I'm allowed to take liberties as a writer and make up whatever imaginary scene might kind of fit the history as much as I would like. Next, I wanted to share, pause and talk about it for a second before you start reading it. I wanted to share one that actually was just published, coincidentally, in a journal in North Carolina days after the recent hurricanes. It had been written long before that, but that is when it happened to come out. And it's a poem about climate change in a way, and it's a very hard thing, I think, to write about, a topic that has societal importance and that you want to maybe advocate for awareness of, because if you write something that becomes just a manifesto, it's actually not going to be interesting as a piece of literature. And this one does get kind of grim as well, so my apologies for that. But you can tell, again, trying to make it personal and trying to make some details, so you can tell me if I succeeded or not. Oops, that was backwards. Here we go. To my fellow humans, as we watch our world disappear. It's raining so hard on the bridge, my windshield wipers can't keep up. There must be nothing to block the wind along the water. It's all I can do to follow the red hints of taillights and hope the rest of you also move slowly. I wonder if this water on my windshield is a bit of Greenland's glaciers. Had everyone, like me, imagined rising seas would drown our coastal cities with a slow civility? How wrong we were. So obvious now it had to be in storms. Every month fills with hurricanes and hurricanes, running through an alphabet of names and on to Greek letters by fall. 100-year floods happen every year. In a movie, we know we were doomed. Beauty can be ominous too. We see bluebirds in Tennessee. There were none when I grew up there. Armadillos somehow crossed the river too. I had to stop to look again when I first saw one dead beside the road. Every week, the weather radar shows another spiral of colors, a galaxy in red. They keep swinging up the gulf like punches, jab cross into us, until we become the people others barely see, here on the map, here in the clips of houses blowing away. The next one is also related to science and anatomy in a way. It's called an ekphrastic poem, which means a poem that is written based on looking at a piece of visual artwork of some sort. And I mentioned my husband is an artist as well as a physician as well, so we're always, cross fertilizing a bit. And this was in a book of ekphrastic poems about where many different poets wrote about images by the artist, the 16th century artist Vesalius, and his anatomical drawings. And many of his drawings are still very well known today. So this was the drawing that I chose to write about, given the choice of picking any from the book. And I think, if it's okay with you, instead of putting up this poem, I might just keep up the drawing, since the poem is about describing the drawing, and I'll show you the poem shortly after, but we can move up the photo maybe. Of human hands. These hands are like a ghostly specter's claws, drawn upright with nothing left but bone, tendons, muscle, skin, all gone, the scars of a life's labor stripped away. They could be Charon's narrow fingers glimpsed within the shadows of his sleeve, where they wrap around the long pole of his boat. The bare asa metacarpi, with the palms removed, stand like ancient temple columns with no roof. At first, I thought the hands were right and left, facing each other supplicant, like branches of a tree stretched up to draw life from the sun. On closer look, I see the artist drew a right hand front and back, both sides to show all facets of the bones. Thoroughly numbered, both art and teaching tool, an epoch in every Latin labeled finger. Cross-hatching makes the thumbs recede into a different plane, the opposable thumb that marks a human, hands that could grasp a knife, a pen, a child. My hands and fingers, held up side by side, begin to show their age, as if to say, this flesh is but a temporary form. Freckles have been replaced with large brown spots, and blood swells in my veins not far below. My breath flows with that blood to my still beating heart and echoes in the murmured touch of skin to skin. Living or dying, both are ways of changing. Unlike those bones forever fixed upon the page, they have aged past the fleeting softness of connections and need a finger's touch to give them life. Don't know if you caught it or not, but I refer to another artwork at the end with the Michelangelo Sistine Chapel. So the atoms being touched with the finger touch. One final poem I want to read, and then I think we'll have some chance for discussion, I believe. This one may not be the most poetic of poems I've ever written, but I think it's something that students can relate to as you're trying to balance all the busyness in your lives and trying to learn, to take care of whatever else you need to take care of. It was written at a time when I was a young physician, had 2 small children at home, was trying to get a master's degree while working full-time taking care of patients. So it was balancing a huge number of things, also trying to write a little bit here and there. It reminds me how crazy that time was. And if you're not familiar with poetry, I refer to 2 poets in this poem and talking about their poetic processes, to Elizabeth Bishop and to William Carlos Williams. And if you didn't know, William Carlos Williams is one of the best known poets of the 20th century. And he was a pediatrician practicing in New Jersey. Anyway, here's this one. Mixing the batter. Standing in the kitchen, preparing pancakes after cleaning, before soccer, and taking call. The laptop quickly opened on the counter. 3 words written, 2 changed, before the next urgent boo-boo check, wardrobe approval, pigtail repair. Bishop kept her poems on the refrigerator. An image added while the water's boiling, mood shifting from squeezing lemons to chopping onions. Williams' typewriter lived under a leaflet of the desk. In the front room that was both clinic and study, thoughts of wheelbarrows quickly set aside if a neighbor in need came to the door. Thicken with flour, rethink a title, melt the butter, give it a little slant, mix the cinnamon sugar, and weed out some sentiment. 5 minutes between flipping, enough to find the pager, skim the latest Jammer poem, and schedule time to dream. I hope that you all find time to dream. And my, as I said, my husband's also a physician and a creative artist and surgeon. And I'm trying to, be writer and physician. We realized that at one point that we were never going to get the big chunks of time to feed the sides of our lives that we wanted to feed, in everything else that was going on. And so at one point we came up with a 5-minute rule where we would try to have at least 5 minutes a day, even if that was all it was, to devote to either art or poetry. And some days we do none, and we have to not beat ourselves up too much for that. But if we try to have a tiny bit very frequently, it's better than never getting the big chunks that you hope that you will one day get. And so I'll just say, don't forget to water all sides of your life, whatever that is that might interest and sustain you. And thank you very much for having me here today.
Questions? How does your background with poetry and humanities influence the way that
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually have started at the hospital trying to incorporate more of the humanities into teaching. And so, for instance, our medical trainees will have occasional writing sessions, what we call narrative sessions, where we'll bring something, some piece of writing I'll share and talk about it, and then spend just 7 minutes writing, and then discuss that if they want to. I just did a session like that with the neurology residents, and you can't force people to do this. It's often an elective thing to do, but those that do it and like it keep coming back and back again. And the neurology residents were sort of forced because it was put into their regular time, but they asked me back the next year, so I don't think they hated it. But it's you don't know what's going to come out, and next thing you know, the group there, it's not me, the group there is sharing their experiences and the things that brought them to tears that they went home and maybe cried about, but didn't know that others were experiencing as well. And I think that can be very, very useful. And I'll show you, I brought one of my colleagues and some of the residents, and I'm now helping with it, have started a literary journal at the Children's Hospital. This is the 4th edition. We're working on the 5th now. And it's a place for all hospital staff. Anyone that wants to can submit a piece of writing and get it in our own little journal, which is beautiful. I'm amazed at how well they were able to design it. And if anyone wants to see it, you can see what people have written and their, photographs. So it's another cool project. And we started a medical humanities conference that we just had our 2nd annual event this September, and anyone is welcome to come to that. And I'll send future links perhaps.
Please.
And again, if you're interested, it's really a place for people who do this sort of work to talk about it and build up some of that resilience. And again, it's not what's going to work for everybody, but for some people, I think it can be really helpful. And you need to no matter what field you go into, but especially if you go into something as demanding and as emotional as medicine, you need to figure out what will sustain you. If that's exercise, family, cooking, creativity, something, and what that will be.
I was wondering how you publish your poems, or what drove you to actually.
Yeah, it's a good, why put it out there. Part of it is the little bit of a competitive spirit, right? Like when you see, okay, is anyone going to take it? And then wanting to make that connection to see if people like it, and then reading what other people have written and when it means something to me, saying, well, maybe something I've written will mean something to someone else. It is, I'm in academics and have a medical school appointment, so I also have to publish a certain amount to get promoted and all that. It was actually a pretty funny, this is a digression, I'll come back to the School of Medicine Faculty Affairs Office at first told me I should take all the poems off of my CV because this was a hobby. This was not, an academic endeavor. And I refused to take it off. I didn't tell them I refused. I just didn't take it off the CV and left them on there, and pointed out to the physicians on the committee that all of my poems that were published were in some of the highest in medical journals, and that this, it shouldn't count the same as a research paper, but maybe it should count for something. And then I heard from a friend at the committee discussion that was the main thing they talked about. Like, look what she's doing with this poetry. So I was glad I ignored the faculty affairs office. But there's many reasons to want to do it. I have, if anyone wants it, I have a list here of journals that love to publish poetry or essays related to healthcare, whether that's as a provider or as a patient, to try to gather those perspectives and share them. And I have a spreadsheet that, tracks how often what I have written has been accepted. And it's a lesson in grit and perseverance because I've got about an 8% acceptance rate. So of sending things out. So there is a lot of rejection. And so keep doing it, keep sending things out. If you want to be a writer, and just, don't worry about the rejection and you can get some things out of it.
I noticed a common mechanism in some of your poems, many of your poems, that 3 or 4 verses in, you often pivot to another time or another memory, sometimes coming back to the origin, sometimes not. Is that literary strategy, or are you agnostic to that and the writing just flows out when you're
sometimes it just happens, but that can be a strategy. It's called a turn, or sometimes a volta if you want to go back to the Latinate language. And was in theory a characteristic of even like the sonnet form, one of the oldest English poetry forms, where the last, second half of the sonnet, the last 6 lines, were supposed to resolve the questions raised in the earlier ones. And there's one, I think it was a famous poet, Yeats, who said in a poem, you can change time or you can change space, but don't try to change both. Like, you can move places or you can move back in time and back and forth, but don't try to get so chaotic that you're changing everything all at once. I don't know how well I am at following, how well I've done at following rules, but that can definitely be a poetic technique. And it's also something that one of my mentors said to me, that if ever you're stuck in trying to write something, try to zoom in or zoom out. So like, try to take it to the cell or try to take it to the stars, zoom in or zoom out and figure out a way to make a connection there.
So I may have 2 questions. I think that the last poem that you said, or that you recited, kind of talked a little bit about the iterative process and letting it rest and coming back to it and letting your mood change it and letting it change your mood and these other things. And I noticed earlier, I think it was your first poem that you recited was Holiday Concert. And in the citation, you said a previous version.
Yes.
So at what point do you know your poem is done? And do you leave it be?
I've asked my husband this question about his artwork too, because it's a struggle, right?
Yeah.
And that's and you're right, that was previous version because maybe it's never done. Like that one was, that was several years ago that I wrote that. And as I'm trying to put, the book manuscript together, I'm like, and I would change something again, what's that going to be? And so the problem I can run into is I can get stuck in the editing. And going back. And in fact, I had a poet friend criticize me once for using the word edit. She was like, well, why don't you say revise? That's so much better, because revise is like revision, reimagine, and not edit. Like I'm just moving my comma because it's not grammatical. But I can go back and keep working on the old ones forever. And I think that might be the English major in me, and it's sometimes you need to break out of that to go start the really hard brand new imagining of something when you have complete writer's block and you don't know what's going to come out. And that's what's so useful about those, once a month narrative sessions we have with the trainings that are maybe really just for us, but it's you know, like then you're given you read something all together, then you're given a prompt. Like the last one I used was with the neurology residents was write about walking into a room. And then again, you never know what's going to come out. And so you have to start with something, see where you go, and you'll surprise yourself. Did I answer both questions or was that one?
I think so. I don't remember if I asked both questions, but that's okay.
So you mentioned having your colleagues also work. Working fairly prepared, that's a really difficult skill. Do you ever have patients working on poetry?
I have not done that. I have we have in the hospital trained art therapists, trained music therapists, trained psychologists who all, and they're not just there to play games, they are there to help the children cope and the families cope. And while I could imagine that writing could be a part of that coping, I don't feel that therapeutic relationship with my writing is my skill set. And so, and I also, I kind of like keeping a little bit of a separation there. Like I remember one patient's mother who said, I found your poems online, look what I found. And it made me pause a minute because I almost was worried that she had, because I also don't want it to change the relationship. I don't, you know, I never, now you can see sometimes my poems might refer to patients, but I never write about identifiable patients. And I would also never want a patient or a family to think like, oh, is she going to start writing about me, you know, or something like that, when the relationship is actually doctor and patient. So it has felt like, to me, a necessary boundary. And I absolutely think anyone that's going to be in healthcare and writing has to always respect confidentiality and think seriously about how they do that. But it may not be true of every physician writer that they have the exact same line I do.
I noticed quite a few of your poems seem like they're pulling specific moments.
Mm-hmm.
Do those moments hit you in the moment? This is a poem, or do you discover them as you write?
Some of both. So those moments do sometimes hit me, and I can shut this door. Is that what you're getting? Yeah. Those moments will sometimes hit me, but I don't often have time to write about them in that moment. And I just have a running Word document on my computer and a notes page on my phone that's, you know, probably a few hundred pages of noting some of these things. And every once in a while, when I'm stuck in that, like, oh, I really should keep editing, I should stop editing all the old stuff and start something new, I may go back and look through that and be like, okay, what were those things that occurred to me? Some people will do that where they keep a notebook by their bedside for writing their dreams when they can remember them first thing in the morning and use that as a big source of material. But I rarely write right after noticing that moment. It's much more often that I find time later. And it also then gives me time to reflect and do probably some processing of, you know, like if I've been in a, I wrote, I probably won't read other poems, but the, you know, I wrote one that about a family that had been really, really, really angry with me in a way, and writing, and they weren't angry with me, they were angry at the situation. It was a horrible situation. They were angry at the situation. But writing about that helped me probably not get defensive or not get upset, and to understand a little bit more how they might have felt. Did you have another?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, some of your poems are separated into stanzas. And
Yeah.
there's, like one specific poem that was just.
Yeah, it's also an excellent question, and I'm trying to figure that one out myself sometimes. And you know, I go to workshops and things, and people will say, "Oh, this one should be in such and such. This one should be like that." And like, you know, what is it supposed to be like? I think you have to play around with it and see what the poem wants. If you listen to the true experts out there that they say then it just starts to feel right at some point. I have one poet mentor friend who gets very into the numerology, and it gets a little frustrating because I'm like, not everyone really thinks about this, but it'll be like, oh, if you have 3 line stanzas, it's referring to the Trinity. If you have 4 line stanzas, it's referring to men, and like, what? But he truly believes that these things come out of our, Jungian psychological depths without our knowledge. And sometimes you have to play around with it. And like, sometimes you need a little more space but the pauses should be somewhat intentional, as does one big tool in poetry is where do you end the line? And it's not just to make it a nice square poem. It's like, are you ending the line somewhere where it can maybe have a little bit of an extra meaning? Like the one letting go, the next to last line, I end with all she had ever done, when I was talking about her not walking or talking. And so you could almost start to imagine, does all she had ever done mean she didn't do anything at all, but teach them what it means to love? She had done a huge amount.
Are there any medical schools that have creative experiences as requirements? I mean, and if so, I mean, you show that these things have outcomes in terms of empathy or patient outcomes.
Right. Yeah. And that's how do you show these things? How do you prove this worth, especially in days of limited funding and who gets time paid for things? Cooper Medical School is doing an amazing job with their humanities department. And it's a relatively young medical school. And when it was founded, they wanted to make sure that they included the whole person, the whole physician, in thinking about the training and in doing. So they have a humanities department, as Penn State does, UVA does. We're pondering whether we could start something similar at the Children's Hospital. We've got our journal, we've got our conference. We may never have a department, or maybe we can, but we have to figure out how to fund that and fund the time. Being able to show that it makes a difference is a fascinating question. And there certainly have been studies out there that try to look at coping and mood and things of that sort. Nothing to my knowledge about patient outcomes. But you could imagine, anything that improves communication, maybe it decreases lawsuits, maybe, like what are the reasons that you should convince your hospital to help support people's time for this sort of work? But I'm not aware of anything looking at actual patient outcomes. Now, I think there probably is for like art therapy, music therapy, things like that have, shown that they absolutely can be of benefit to patients and families.
But I mean, as opposed to having an indirect via the physician.
Via the physicians, becoming better physicians. Yeah. Our medical school, there's a medical humanities council that is super student driven. It's the students that are asking for this and demanding it and making more and more programs being developed. It's all elected still right now, but they are the ones that are driving it and asking for it.
Is there a singular person that inspires you the most?
Fascinating. Wow. I can't.
Or a person you keep going back to?
Keep going back to for there's so many, someone else said I'm doing so many different things. There's so many different areas where there are things, and I'm kind of a loner in some ways, so maybe I'm not collaborative in the way of always seeking out those people that are inspiration, but there's so many. I think reading what others have written can be truly wonderful, and just again, if you want to write, try to read as much as you can and just be constantly reading. I love, like Jane Hirschfield, the things that she writes philosophically move me as well as the language. I love to read anything written by Thich Nhat Hanh. There's just probably more, like there are inspirational scientists who have changed the world. There's so many different areas. So I probably would struggle to name one single person.
your experience with writing poems, ever differentiate different types of poems that other opposed to like the favorites that you might ever try to find sonnets
Yeah,
or
yeah.
haikus or
Yes, I have some haiku. You want to hear a haiku? These are not published. I brought another little packet of poems in case some came up, and I just wrote some haiku recently that I just sent to a journal to see if they would take them. So here's 3 haiku. And yeah, I have sometimes published sonnets. I have sometimes written blank verse, sometimes a villanelle. Tried to play around. I have done more for years than anything else. 3 sonnets. Hospital window, the cooling sky, calligraphy of peace. Uneven stone path, the walker stutters, a circle of dried sage. Day of surgery, I bump the vase, pink shards fill the sink. Ryaku.
I was wondering if when you started poems, did you ever have like a sense of like imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm in a writing group right now where I have horrible imposter syndrome because, you know, many of the others in the group have published more poems than me. And even if they haven't, I think that they are like so much better at this and more experienced at it than I am because I haven't had that much time. But I have to steel myself to get over that and to just keep doing it and to know that if I do, I will get better and better and better. And, you know, like reading out loud is actually hard for me. I don't know how, you know, easy it was to understand what I was saying or what I was reading but it is something that doesn't necessarily come easily. And so, you know, like get over the worry and get out there and, you know, go ahead and be willing to be an imposter. I think it was, who was the right, Rainer Maria Rilke once, I think, who said you have to have a beginner's mind for everything that you do. And that you'll actually discover so much more if you go with a beginner's mind to do whatever that might be.
Did you start writing? This is like a 2-part question. So did you start writing like majority for yourself?
Probably. I think it was my way of processing, and I was you know, my bio at the start, I was an English literature major before medicine, but I actually didn't write that much at that time. It really took the experiences in medicine to like almost give me some of my subject matter.
Okay, so now that you have things published and you're doing more things with it, how do you maintain like a family for myself and not other people? Because you know, you said you look at others and you know they have more like more things published and you know you haven't written as much, but like if it's something that helps you process it, how do you try not to like keep
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Try not to. It's a risk. I definitely do sometimes, and I mean, to end up going to medical school, you know, I have my competitive side. I've always wanted to be, you know, the best student at everything, blah blah blah, whatever that was. It's a, you know, but comparison is the thief of joy, and you know, if I was always comparing myself to someone else, then I would never keep trying. And I think the other, you know, the other thing to realize is if I go back, I keep on my computer every old version of every poem, and some of them are really horrible. And you know, and some of them stay horrible for their whole lives, but that's okay. But some of them are really horrible at the beginning and eventually get better. And, you know, I could find the old versions of some of these. And I once saw, again, Yeats, who's one of the, you know, best known poets in history, once saw some early drafts of some of his poems somewhere. It's like, oh my God, they weren't that good, you know? And it was like this realization. He didn't come out with fully formed, you know, best poem in history, the first draft. So did I answer your question?
Yeah. You said that you try not to compare yourself.
Yeah.
So
And
it's something that you do still for yourself.
yeah, But, and I still do for myself, but what I have to be careful about is that I don't start beating myself up about the thing that I'm trying to do for my own self-care
Yeah.
and sustaining myself. So if I start saying to myself, you know, you're so horrible, you haven't written in a month, like, why do you think you're calling yourself a writer? You know, that's not going to be healthy. It's kind of like you can use that maybe to be like, oh yeah, it's a new day. Okay, let me write tomorrow a little bit, just a little bit. I can make the time. But don't beat yourself up for not having done it in a month. Right?
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Dr. Morrison once more. Number of people online were saying thank you as
Oh,
well.
awesome. Thank you.